Okay. Now, I have to use a cheat sheet because once y'all get to my age, you'll understand.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But they gave me the opportunity to create my own presentations, very much like Tom does, and the only stipulation being that they need to be relevant to what we're doing and what we're seeing and that sort of thing, right? So obviously, for where we are and what you experience today and what you'll experience tomorrow, I wanted to do an overview of Southern plantations, the development and history of Southern plantations. I can already tell I'm not going to follow my cheat sheet, so you'll just have to forgive me. Just very quickly though, tomorrow's excursions at 9 a.m. is going to be the Halmas House and grounds. And then we get back on board, sail downriver just a little bit farther to Oak Alley and grounds. And you can see Oak Alley literally is right on the river. Obviously, I'm not the person to tell you about those excursions, but Carrie and Hannah will be back right here at 8:10 to give you all those details with their presentation, Chart Your Course. Just very quickly, since this is my first presentation, I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a multi-generational Memphian. My people have been in West Tennessee since my fourth great-grandfather redeemed his father's Revolutionary War land grant there in 1827. I was an architect for 25 years and have been semi-retired for 10. Over the Christmas holiday of 2012, I hopped onto a 2-week free trial of Ancestry.com and I was instantly hooked. Literally by the time of the end of that 2-week trial, I had already designed the book cover, had the Facebook page and everything. Actually, my Nancy designed the book cover. But I do hope to eventually tell their story in book form, because what it's done is by studying my family, and we've been here since Jamestown, it's really helped me to understand the history of the country far beyond, just a textbook. I've even read my 5th great-grandfather's journal, and that's pretty astounding. One thing that's kind of cool, can you see the background text on the book cover? That's actually my 3rd great-grandfather's handwriting in the family Bible, telling the dates of everything. So that's the introduction of me. Before we get started, though, I have if y'all remember in school, show and tell for you. Now, one of the things I do as a hobby is I love to refinish old furniture, right? Believe it or not, a month ago, I picked this up on the side of the road for free, all right? I've since learned in talking to the guy who put it out there that this sat in his great-grandmother's parlor in a pre-Civil War home that's about 20 miles east of Memphis. And he said he didn't want it. And so I put it on my trailer and I took it back to my shop. So you can tell by the style and the age and the construction and everything that this is definitely a Civil War era piece of furniture. So when I got it home, and that tear there you see in the seat, which is much easier to repair than you imagine, I realized that the cotton stuffing that couch was picked by slaves. Okay? And I have some of that right here. I'm going to pass this around, so you're welcome to reach in and touch it. When you touch this cotton, you are reaching back 160 years and touching the hand of the slave who picked it. And I think that's pretty astounding. Y'all just pass that around. I don't know how many of y'all had show and tell in school, but I always thought it's cool. So anyway, getting back to the history of Southern plantations, You all know the story of Gone with the Wind, right? And some of the larger, beautiful houses that we've been visiting. Well, that's only 1% of the story, right? The actual story, or the story of the other 99%, was much more humble than that. A plantation, generally around 300 to 500 acres, was literally just a self-contained family unit where everybody pitched in, everybody helped grow the crops, you know, and that sort of thing. You raise your own animals and everything. So that's the story that I hope y'all will let me tell, right? So, right off the bat, we need to start by recalling that America was founded as a British colony. Britain was, and still is, a monarchy. The entire socio-political structure is based on a very rigid class system. And throughout their history, the way the crown maintained control was by doling out vast estates to their loyal and supportive subjects. One such estate, which you see here, was Hollingsworth Hall, which was built about 10 miles east of Manchester, not long after the Norman conquest of 1066. So this is where the concept of large southern manor houses came from, because they considered themselves landed gentry, just the way their ancestors did back in England. One unfortunate reality to keep in mind is that to the dominant European monarchies, England, France, and Spain, the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere were literally a non-entity. The ruling classes felt that God had preordained the New World as their own, and they officially claimed it as such, which is what you see here. Obviously, England there along the eastern seaboard, France in the middle, and then Spain is the yellow. The first two British attempts to gain a toehold across the pond that actually took root were Jamestown, Virginia, and Plymouth, Massachusetts. Obviously, the states are just on there for reference, so you can see. While Plymouth, and what would later become the northern United States, was founded by religious dissidents, Jamestown, and what would later become the southern United States, was founded as an extension of the British landed gentry. America was literally set up as two different countries destined to clash from day one. The first wave of settlers to Jamestown in 1607 were little more than English aristocrats seeking to grow their already vast fortunes in a vain quest for gold. But the harsh realities of taming the essentially virgin New World immediately proved fatal. The entire, all but just a handful of the first wave of settlers to Jamestown died. If not for the efforts of one man, Captain John Smith, Jamestown would have vanished into obscurity just as Roanoke had a quarter century before. Captain Smith understood that the primary necessities were food and shelter. You can see here to the lower left corner the original fort and the crude houses and stuff within the original fort. I'm going to have to remember to bring my reading glasses. Anybody got any readers? Yeah. You can see the original timber enclosure and crude huts in this artist rendition of Jamestown circa 1614. Oh, I'm just kidding. Well,
wow, those are cool.
Those are nice.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that makes it just a tad worse. But it's all right. I was working on it all morning, so I think I kind of have it. No, it's quite all right. Let's see, where were we? Captain Smith, yada yada yada. So this is an artist rendition of what Jamestown looked like about 7 years after the first wave of settlers. By the second and third waves, which is when my people came over, the settlers had humbled themselves to the laws of nature, and their toehold began to extend beyond the early fort, which is what you see there. These first Americans, now this is important to the story, These first Americans lived and worked side by side, driven by the understanding that their shared destinies were intertwined. There was no class system. You didn't work, you didn't eat. The first enslaved Africans arrived in August of 1619. They had been forcibly removed from a Portuguese slave ship bound for the Spanish colony of present-day Veracruz, Mexico, and delivered to Jamestown by the English pirate ship White Lion. In the beginning, English custom allowed for Africans to be freed after their initial term of servitude, which was typically 7 years. If you ride the ferry across the James River from Jamestown, you will land in Surry County, Virginia, which was founded in part by these early freed African Americans. It wasn't until 1640 that indentured servitude for Africans gave way to enslavement for life. By the time Williamsburg was flourishing in the last quarter of the 17th century, the English class structure, and unfortunately its evil twin entitlement, had returned with a vengeance. Although crops and livestock were raised within the confines of the settlement, the crown-appointed governor lived in a palatial mansion, and many of the other residences were merely townhomes where the landed gentry could rub elbows while not overseeing their rural plantations. And by the way, we also have an American Revolution cruise that goes through there with an excursion to Williamsburg, it's phenomenal. I love it. Thankfully for the heart and soul of our burgeoning country, the other type of plantation, a self-contained and self-sufficient family farm, more geared towards survival than generating wealth, dominated European incursions into the frontier. And it was these hardy souls, not the entitled gentry, who are the most responsible for carving Western civilization out of the northern American wilderness. So the first step when you're venturing out onto the leading edge of the frontier is, of course, you have to clear the land. Any trees that were the proper size for construction, which were generally between 6 and 24 inches in diameter, were felled with the axe. The smaller trees were used for fencing and livestock enclosure, the larger for habitable structures. Since there were no sawmills and thus no way to make usable lumber out of the larger trees, they were girdled, like you see here, and left to die where they stood. So girdling is where they cut out the bark, right, which is the living part of the tree. You cut that out and the tree dies because the nutrients can't make their way up to the rest of the tree, because that's the living part of the tree. So then they would just stand there and die, and the wind would blow them over, and a few years later, that sort of thing. Where they stood. Once the underbrush was burned off, then you were ready to start building on that piece of property. Now, this next part is real important because you have to keep in mind, I'm talking about the people who created the leading edge of the frontier, and then over the course of, we'll say, a decade, that new homestead developed into a working class plantation, right? Which is what my people did in 1827. So the first structure would have been a crude one-room log cabin, very much like this one, which was shared by both the two-legged and the four-legged members of the family. This particular example was built by my maternal third great-grandfather when my family first moved to West Tennessee in 1827. It was passed down through various branches of the family and last used as a smokehouse in the 1960s until it was relocated, restored, and then put on display to the public.
Where's that?
It's in Arlington, Tennessee, which is in the eastern part of Shelby County. Which is where they settled. We didn't make it into Memphis until 1840. Some families may have opted to start their new homestead by building a log barn. Either way, people and critters were going to share sleeping quarters, and whichever came first until the other was built. So if you built your barn first, then the family slept in the barn, or if you built your log cabin first, then the critters slept in the log cabin. If the family got lucky and survived the first couple of years, they might celebrate by expanding the original cabin. Here are a few cousins on the front porch of their 2-story cabin in West Tennessee circa 1880. Now Ma and Pa could finally have a little privacy for making more farmhands, which is where we got our farmhands. But, I realize a lot of people think Beverly Hillbillies when they see this, but in West Tennessee, all throughout the 19th century, this was what was considered a successful home. If you could put a roof over your family's head, you were just beyond successful. You can see a structure back there in the back. That may be to the left, that may be a kitchen, it may be part of the barn. The aunt who gave me this picture we didn't talk about that. Then of course you see the stone chimney on the end. That would have been used for cooking as well as the fireplace. If you got really lucky and somehow managed to survive your first 3 to 4 years, you would eventually build another cabin next to the first one, connect the two, and create what's called a dog trot house. That's what this is here. Literally, they would start out as 2 separate cabins. You can see the vertical breaks up top. The logs don't go straight through all the way across. Those are connected like that. So this is what's called a dog trot house. The name is derived from the connecting central corridor, which not only drew a welcome breeze, but also allowed the family dog to trot straight through the house as well. Few families survived intact long enough to make it to the next level of plantation development, but for those who did, something like this would have served as the big house. Now, we've heard that term before, and we think Gone with the Wind. This is a working class family big house. Still typically built around the original cabin, the 4-square, 4 rooms up and 4 rooms down, was the epitome of success for the working class family. These last 2 slides, this one and of the dog trot, are courtesy of some of my more fancier cousins, whose former plantation is actually now a living history museum about 20 miles east of downtown Memphis. Now, we talked about African Americans early on, and that is certainly a vital part of American history. But few of these working class families had slaves. And for those who did, they rarely owned more than half a dozen or so. And yes, before the Civil War, some branches of my family did own slaves. But in these more tight-knit situations, the relationship was decidedly more humane than on the larger cash crop plantations. While the white family members were, of course, free to come and go as they pleased, as long as they stuck around, they were expected to not only pull their own weight, but to work and contribute to the overall survival of the family unit as a whole. None of this, pointing from the porch while you drink your mint julep. After the Civil War, many of the wealthier Southern families who had spent the previous 2 centuries living high on the hog also got to experience what it was like to actually earn their own keep. Now, obviously, this is a passion of mine, history is, and I use researching my own family as a tool for learning history. But to me, it just makes it come more alive. I can relate to it personally more, right? But I need to tell y'all, before we get to the Q&A, I definitely want to have a Q&A. I want to tell you just one last little tidbit about my family. This, I practiced this over and over so I wouldn't choke up, but I'm going to anyway. This was actually my father's ancestral estate. So we were landed gentry in England before we came here. We actually helped Oliver Cromwell colonize Ireland on the way. And then it was my 8th great-grandfather who came over with William Penn. And no, I haven't been there. In fact, the manor house, it stood for 1,000 years, but it got torn down in the 40s. This is the house where my father and his mother were born. This is a dog trot house. I'm gonna have to start reading again, I'm sorry. I don't want to get choked up. This is the dog trot house where both my father and his mother were born. I was fortunate enough to have spent a few nights there myself as a child. While some may see this as a decline in family fortune, I see it as a welcome reality check. My father's family farm, or plantation if you will, consisted of 300 acres in North Mississippi, about 300 miles southeast of Memphis. In addition to the house and barn, there was also a smokehouse, chicken coop, hog pen, well house, and 3 or 4 other assorted outbuildings. There were a few acres fenced off for cows and a few more for vegetables and watermelons, as well as a pond for turtles and crappie. This fare would have been supplemented by hunting small game, deer, and wild boar. My great-grandmother still cooked on a wood-fired potbelly stove, churned her own butter, and canned everything on the pantry shelves. Jellies were made from wild raspberries, blackberries, and muscadines, and slathered onto biscuits that were made from flour bought in 50-pound sacks. Lunch was a slice of onion, and this is one of my favorite memories actually. Lunch was a slice of onion or tomato on a leftover cold biscuit, washed down with ice-cold well water from an aluminum dipper. Supper was always 3 to 4 different homegrown vegetables cooked in hog fat, garnished with pickled cucumbers or pickled watermelon rind. Yes, I said that right. We pickled watermelon rind. Meat was reserved for Sunday dinner, holidays, or some other special occasion. My great-grandfather built every stick. My great-grandfather built every stick of every structure on the farm with his own hands. One of my most prized possessions, y'all know these big chifforobe closet things? I saved one of those from this house that he not only built, but he cut down the tree and milled the lumber. And it's literally one of my most prized possessions. He tilled his own soil, fixed his own tractor, and never owned more than 2 pairs of overalls at a time in his life. That's one of them. The same was true of my dad when he finally came up to Memphis. He and I went to both went to the same junior high school, of course, 30 years apart. And he only had 2 pairs of overalls. And my grandmother would wash one while he wore the other. And God forbid you tore your overalls. Doctors were unheard of except in the most dire of emergencies, and even then only if he felt like making the drive. But during the Great Depression, when so many in this country and around the world were starving, not one person in his family ever missed a meal. Wow. So, I'm sorry, so just to end on a lighter note, I have to confess, some of the Southern stereotypes you may have heard are true. One of those is that girls were expected to marry and start cranking out farmhands, typically by the age of like 16. It never always occurred in that order, but eventually the marriage would happen. And then women at the time, they were expected to continue cranking out farmhands as long as their bodies were able. So what that would do is it would result in generational overlaps. So this is actually my dad standing next to his mother's little sister, next to the biggest watermelon you're ever going to see in your life. Thank you. Thank you. A few of you were kind enough to offer to be my shill and let me give you some questions to ask. But I'm not quite that prepared. But please, somebody ask a question, and I don't care. It could be embarrassing or whatever. I don't care. Go right ahead. Yes, I'm my own third cousin once removed. Let's just get that out there. It's unfortunately true. Yes, sir, please.
How many people here have had a big biscuit with molasses and butter put in?
Right. Molasses or butter or homemade jelly.
That might be dinner too.
Yeah, a big slab of ham. They cured all their own hams, made all their own bacon. A cow would typically be taken to be slaughtered somewhere. The most damning thing I remember early on about how things work is I can remember my great-grandfather, it would have been somewhere around 1970, he was just completely blown away by the idea that the United States government was paying him not to grow crops. It was part of the price control program, and so he was being paid not to grow crops. So he built a house, a brick house, right across the driveway from that one with the money.
Not a question, but a comment. My grandmother and my great grandmother were pregnant at the same time. And so my dad
Not by the same person, I hope.
No. But my dad was born and his uncle was born a couple weeks later.
Yeah.
Right on. Yeah. So I very clearly remember my Aunt Frances. She was a favorite. I don't want to interrupt cocktail hour. Certainly, please get a drink or whatever. But somebody ask a question. Yes, sir.
What kind of vegetables, or did you grow vegetables?
Man, that's a great question because I remember very clearly. We would have okra, black-eyed peas, or purple hull peas. I could never tell the difference. But I definitely remember once you picked them, you'd split them open and run your thumb up there, and they'd all fall out into a pin. Obviously, corn, tomatoes, those sorts of things. But what would happen? And someone posted about this earlier. What was the shucking party? I can't remember. But I definitely remember we would all sit around on the porch and either be shucking corn or doing the peas or whatever. To this day, I still hate okra. But things like that. Now, I'll tell you, and I'm sure most of y'all here will remember, back in the day, tomatoes used to be red. You know?
Oh, yeah.
They weren't these mealy little old things that they make today. And I could sell them for $5 a piece if I could find some seed that wasn't tarnished. They would be that big around. Get you a slab about that thick, slap it on some Wonder Bread or a biscuit. It was awesome. Please, yes.
Really cool.
I'm sorry, can you do your, thanks. Yeah.
I'd love to see a picture of what the plant of okra looks like.
A plant of okra looks like?
Like I've never seen
Looks like marijuana.
Well,
farmer party.
if my phone weren't recording this, I would Google it and pop it up for you. But I'll show you one at dinner.
Okay.
How's that? All right, one more question, and then I've got to go. I have people waiting on me. There he goes. Thank you, sir.
Your family, did all their stuff say there for them to support, or they do things to try to sell to bring money?
Absolutely a great question. So one of the things that would happen is as more and more people joined you on the leading edge of the frontier, you might have one person that built wagons, one person who tanned leather, another person who was a blacksmith, but you all were interdependent on one another. Now, my great-grandfather, they did eventually reach a point where they had extra crop, right? So the closest town was about 6 miles away, so they would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, load the wagon with some of this excess crop, drive it into town, sell it, or what they could, and then drive back, and that was literally a full day chore to get that done. And my father's told me about that, riding the wagon into town. Yeah. Anybody else? Going. Thank y'all so much for coming. I really love it.